the recorded version of Understanding the Older LGBT Community and Its Unique Needs and Barriers from August 28, 2019. Brought to you by the American Society on Aging and a generous sponsorship from Right at Home.
Okay, our presenter today is Paul Blom. Paul is owner and CEO of Right at Home Twin Cities, a locally and nationally known advocate for older adults. With his husband, Bob, Paul has, since 2001, owned and operated Right at Home in-home care and assistance for seniors in the Twin Cities. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to our presenter today, Paul Blom. Welcome, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Steve. As Steve mentioned, my husband and I have owned a franchise of Right at Home since 2001. And personal experience in providing home care services completely to an elderly community and finding some disparities within the older LGBT and or T population. And that's really kind of how this began. Some research started to evolve in the 2005-2006 timeframe, and groups of people here in Minnesota started to kind of rally around that research and realized that the research was showing some significant needs and barriers within this particular community. So eventually we actually did some fundraising and created a nonprofit called Training to Serve, and we created a 4-hour curriculum to train senior service providers, primarily here in the state of Minnesota. Started that effort in 2010, and since then have trained over 13,000 senior service providers in the state of Minnesota and some across the country. The intention of this training really is to help people who serve seniors understand the unique needs and barriers of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender older population, regardless of personal feelings or spiritual beliefs about issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. What we found in the research really was that older LGBT and or T folks have higher health needs, so higher risks related to those health needs, and 1 in 5 of the respondents believed that less than 1 in 5 believed that they would receive safe, good quality aging services if their sexual orientation or gender identity were known to their providers. And so we went to the provider community and asked them if they understood this or if they'd be willing to learn, and they all said they would be willing to learn, so we created this curriculum. The original curriculum was 4 hours in length, so this is a very, very brief overview. What we're going to do today is really talk about the difference between sexual orientation, gender identity. We're going to talk about the barriers that we found in the research, which was specific to Minnesota, but there's national research that concurs. And then talk about the opportunities that we have as individual practitioners and organizations to present a more welcoming environment. So jump right in. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about 4 areas of being a human being that we all have and we all share on a spectrum. And we're going to talk about those in kind of a non-binary way. We're going to talk specifically about how they relate to the older LGBT and or T population. We won't have the time to kind of get into the difference in language that's being used in today's world for a younger generation, but we do get into that in the longer sessions. So we're going to talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and the sex that we are assigned at birth. So the first one that we're going to talk about is sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is who you are physically, spiritually, and emotionally attracted to based on their sex or gender in relation to your own. So on the right end of the spectrum, we have people who are attracted to people of the same sex. Those people are often identified as gay or lesbian. So men who are attracted to other men are gay men, women who are attracted to other women being gay women, or homosexual. On the opposite end of the spectrum, to the left, we have people who are attracted to the people of the opposite sex. So men who are attracted to women, women who are attracted to men. In the middle, we have people who are bisexual. Those are people who have the capacity to be attracted physically, spiritually, and emotionally to someone of either gender as it relates to their own. And this is really the first instance where that little phrase at the end about based on sex or gender in relation to your own becomes important. People who are bisexual, like most human beings, kind of walk through life and have one relationship at a time. Oftentimes people who are bisexual are identified by the rest of the population with labels that society wants to put on them based on the relationship they're in. So if a person who's bisexual capacity to be attracted to someone of either gender if their high school relationship is with someone of the opposite sex, then the rest of society wants to label them as heterosexual. If they go off to college and that high school relationship has run its course, and they go off to college and they meet someone in their chemistry class or whatever of the same sex, and they decide to have a relationship with that person, now society wants to label them as homosexual or as gay or lesbian. And so you can see where people who are bisexual are oftentimes counted by society not as bisexual, which is their sexual orientation, but as the label based on the relationship that they're currently in. I'm going to skip 2 slides here because they just got out of order. So sexual orientation, again, it's about attraction. Sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to physically, spiritually, and emotionally as their sex or gender relates to your own. You can see from this slide that sexual orientation runs a very large gamut. So everything from straight people, lesbian women who are attracted to other women, gay men who are attracted to other men, people who are bisexual who have the capacity to be attracted to either, people who are pansexual, which is a sexual orientation which transcends kind of all of the other labels, and people who are asexual who really don't express sexuality or in any of those manners. So you'll notice that sexual orientation occupies 3 of the letters in the acronym LGB and or T, and that's part of the reason why I often say LGB and or T, is to make that distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity. So the primary categories of sexual orientation then are the L, the G, and the B in the minority acronym, and then the heterosexual or straight people. So those are the 4 primary categories that we talk about. So moving on to the next category that we all have is sex assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth are the objectively measurable organs, hormones, and chromosomes that make us on a spectrum from one end of the spectrum as male or masculine to the other end of the spectrum as female or feminine. In the middle, a little bit less than 1% of the time, children are born with either confusing or both genitalia. And in old times, we would have referred to those children as hermaphrodites. Well, we don't use that term anymore. That doesn't actually have anything to do with the human species. So we use the term intersex. In 60 to 110 years ago, when children were born as intersex or as hermaphrodites, as they were referred to back in those days, oftentimes, most of the time, there was a decision to be made about whether that child would leave the hospital and have a birth certificate that says male or female, and that oftentimes involved a surgical intervention, typically the path of least resistance to help that child, if you will, be either fully male or fully female so that it could be put on the birth certificate in that manner. So we can see that times have changed, right? In the modern world, we have lots of hormonal and chromosomal testing that we can do, and we've advanced in our understanding of these things. But again, as it relates to our older population, generally speaking, anyone 60 to 110 years ago would have had an immediate surgical intervention to bring them into being fully male or fully female. So where that starts to kind of take shape when we start thinking about gender identity, which again, we all have gender identity. Most people really never have to think about it. So gender identity is this thing, this incredibly real thing that's in your head, that it's how you think about yourself on a spectrum of man on one end or masculine, or female or feminine or woman on the other end. Now this concept of gender identity is incredibly, incredibly real, and again, most people don't ever really have to think about it. In a modern, in kind of younger generations, you'll see that on this slide we have used for the first time the word queer. And oftentimes people ask why we don't use LGBTQ, and it's because our curriculum was really designed to address the needs of the older LGB and or T population. And the word queer for that population of people really was used as a really terribly derogatory word. It was definitely used as a word to let people who specifically identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, to let them know that they were not deserving of the same rights that everybody else in society was, that in their history, And this is one of the things that we realize that really kind of creates this unique set of needs and barriers. And in the full 4-hour training and 2-hour trainings, we go through an exercise called the timeline exercise. We talk about some of the things that happened historically that have really informed the perspective of these unique set of needs and barriers. What happens in a lot of minority communities is there are words that in history that the broader society has used to denigrate a population, of minority population, and subsequent generations will take back those words. And queer is an example of this within the LGBTQ, if you will, community, where kind of the tail end of Generation X, the millennials, and now Generation Z coming up, have really taken back the use of the word queer. And it does two things. It takes away the power from the word, right? So if broader society used a word like queer to denigrate the minority communities around sexual orientation and gender identity, when the younger generation takes it back and uses the word to identify themselves, it strips the word of its power, and the rest of society stops using the word. The other thing that this word queer really does, especially as it relates to kind of this notion of gender identity, is allows people who don't identify strongly as masculine or man, or strongly as feminine or female, their place in the middle, their very real place in the middle, which is not strongly masculine or feminine, but gender queer. There are a few other terms that the younger generation uses: gender non-binary, or gender nonconforming, and we'll see more and more of this expression. Again, our older population, 60 to 110 years old, people still tend to operate out of that binary kind of structure and identify gender as mostly either masculine or feminine. So when we think about gender identity, we think about gender expression, right? We have this notion of, based on traditional gender roles or societal stereotypes, right? We express our gender in different ways. So either very strongly feminine on one end of the spectrum, or very strongly masculine on the other end of the spectrum, or everywhere in between, right? So somebody who identifies as gender queer or gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, would really express themselves in a more androgynous kind of perspective. So you see a person whose dress and hair and attire doesn't speak either masculinely or femininely, but somewhere in between. It has kind of that androgynous perspective. So when we talk about this notion of sex assigned at birth, gender identity, when we talk about gender identity, whether it is in line with or not in line with the sex that we are assigned at birth. And that's where this topic of transgender comes from. So people who are transgender, it's different than people who are genderqueer, who don't identify strongly masculine or feminine. But a person who is transgender actually is a person whose gender identity, the thing inside of their head that says masculine, feminine, or somewhere in between, is opposite of or differs from the sex or gender they were assigned at birth. So in this example, and this slide is actually incorrect. Unfortunately, we redid this slide deck specifically for this presentation, and we didn't catch this. So terminology-wise, a trans woman would be someone who was born male but lives as female or expresses a female gender identity. And the opposite is true of trans man. So the labels underneath the pictures are wrong, but the pictures themselves and the descriptions underneath are right. So if you would reverse trans woman and trans man on that slide, I apologize for that. But so a trans male then would be someone who was born as female but lives and expresses a gender identity of male. So it is exactly opposite. And I think about the first experience that I had where I really was challenged to understand this in a way that was more real than it was kind of on paper. When I worked in the IT industry about 23 years ago, prior to being in the home care industry, I had a colleague, Sherry, who actually came to me one day and she wanted to know if I would have a conversation with her about her 13-year-old son, Taylor. Now, I had known that Sherry had a 13-year-old son, and I'd never met Taylor, seen pictures of Taylor. And so I thought, of course, as a gay man, I thought she probably thought that Taylor might be gay. And so we went into a conference room, and Sherry proceeded to tell me that Taylor, at 13, told her that he thinks that he's supposed to be a girl. So you can imagine my surprise when that was what Sherry wanted to talk about. And I said to Sherry, what makes you think that I know anything about a 13-year-old boy who thinks he's supposed to be a girl? And Sherry's response was, well, you're gay, aren't you? And that was, so that, an example in an instance of how we have kind of taken this acronym, right, LGBT or GLBT as it used to be in the Midwest, and really turned it into something that as a society we think is all one thing. And the reality is that it's two separate things, right? We had the conversation about attraction, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual part of the acronym, and now we're talking about gender identity, which is the T portion. So after I realized that I was probably as close as Sherry was going to find to somebody who would be sensitive about this issue, I went to Sherry's house, and I sat down at the kitchen table across the table from this adorable 13-year-old boy named Taylor, and I looked into the eyes of a 13-year-old girl who was trapped inside the body of a 13-year-old boy. And I listened to the anxiety and the angst and the fears and the suicidal ideation of this 13-year-old girl that was trapped literally inside the body of a 13-year-old boy. And I realized at that moment in a very profound way that this construct, this idea of gender identity, this thing in our head that identifies us as masculine or feminine or somewhere in between is really incredibly real, and that for someone whose gender identity is opposite of the sex they were assigned at birth, what an incredibly difficult place to be, and the reality that most of us never have to think about it, right? Because most of us, 99 or so percent of humans, have a gender identity that matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. And that, you will see on the bottom of the slide, is identified as cisgender. So the people like myself, I was born, identified, sex assigned at birth was male, grew up fully identifying with my maleness, if you will. That would be an example of cisgender. So cis is the Latin term for on the same side as. So if your gender identity, the thing inside of your head, says the same thing as the sex you were assigned at birth, then you are cisgender. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the actual research as it relates to this community in terms of the kind of the unique set of needs and barriers that this community experiences. And I just mention a couple of things before we move into that, things from the actual timeline. When we think about LGBTQ history, and we think about the fact that this year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And the reason for the Stonewall riots is that during those decades, right around the 50s and the 60s, the police were raiding bars that were catering to homosexual people and arresting people and publishing their names so that the public would see that they were arrested as being homosexual. People would lose their jobs. People would be alienated by their families. We think about some of the things that a lot of us don't know in the 30s. In the 30s, we were showing that they were doing electric shock therapy, and they were publishing it as successful cure for homosexuality. We know that up until 1975, there was a ban on employment for federal employment. So somebody who was openly gay or lesbian could be fired if they were a U.S. postal delivery carrier. We know that until the 90s, homosexuality was listed as a mental illness. So there are a lot of things over the course of the last 100 years that really have informed our older LGB and or T folks to really solidify that notion of queer as something that is sickness, is not to be deserving of the same rights. And so there's no surprise when we think about those things and we think about some of the health disparities. So within older lesbian and bisexual women, incredibly increased rates of poverty. When you think about kind of the double whammy of being the sexual orientation minority and also being female in a society where women still don't, to this day, have equality as it relates to employment opportunity and pay. We know that they have higher rates of cancer. We've known that for a while, but we now know that actually there are also higher rates of obesity and cardiovascular disease that contribute to higher rates of certain types of cancer within the older lesbian community. When we think about in terms of coping mechanisms, and you can't generalize for any population, but largely in general. The obesity, and we think about kind of the vice mechanisms that people utilize. The females have a tendency to kind of use a coping skill around food, and so that obesity and that cardiovascular situation kind of stemming out of that coping from that timeline. We see significantly lower reports of accessing routine health care in older lesbian and bisexual women, which of course is a huge problem when you have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of obesity and cardiovascular disease, and lower access to routine health care. We also know that within the entire LGBT population, there are higher rates of caregiving, higher rates of volunteerism, and higher rates of philanthropy. And looking at a lot of that kind of stemming back from the 80s when the community went through the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and many members of the LGBT community were spending time in the hospitals with people who were dying of AIDS because the families had abandoned them, because somebody needed to be there to advocate for them in the healthcare settings to make sure that they received the dignified treatment that they deserved. So we look at the older gay male population. Again, stemming back to this 1980s HIV/AIDS epidemic and that kind of really destruction of that support network. Many gay men in particular lost partners. They lost the constructed families. If they had come out and were kind of disowned by their families, they reconstructed their own families of choice, and a lot of that was really destroyed in the 80s. And so the recreation of that can be really challenging. And so we see that a lot of older gay men live alone. Fewer of them have children, that kind of scenario. That isolation is really significant. And we know that seniors in general experience high rates of isolation, which can lead to lots of health issues. We think about older gay men and that construct of coping mechanisms, right? And so what we see is a lot of in this population, and more so smoking, drinking, some use of drugs. So we have an older gay male population with significantly reduced health situations, lots of chronic health around breathing issues, COPD, and that kind of stuff. The money myth, the idea that gay men are wealthy, doesn't hold true, especially in the older gay male population. When we think about bisexual older adults, and this again, just a reminder, is coming directly from the research. So this is what was reported through research. So they are much less recognized, and again, I mentioned it when we talked about bisexuality, because people who are bisexual are often labeled by society based on the relationship that they're currently in. They actually are the largest number in sexual orientation when you do research about LGB. People identify and self-identify when they're not being named. When the people identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, the majority of people actually identify as bisexual. This notion of being closeted, there's a lot of stigma, even within the LGBT community, around bisexuality. A lot of people, again, even within the LGBT population, don't don't really totally understand this notion of having the capacity to be attracted to someone of either gender, and the fact that that doesn't make somebody more promiscuous. It's not an excuse to have multiple relationships. Generally speaking, most people who are bisexual, like most people, will have a relationship at a time. And so because of that stigma, and again, it's a pretty deep stigma, they're oftentimes closeted related to their sexual orientation. So their sexual orientation is always that of being bisexual. It's always that of having the capacity to be attracted to someone of either sex. But oftentimes, again, they will also allow themselves to be identified based on the relationship that they're currently in. Kind of along the same lines, people who are bisexual report having fewer friends. You can imagine that because of that stigma and that stereotype, and because we know that relationships don't always last a lifetime, that people who are bisexual have a tendency to keep their friendship circles relatively small in comparison to other people, because there is less of that kind of coming out over and over again as it relates to relationships that run their course. So when we think about transgender older adults, and the transgender community is really very, very complicated, and probably more complicated than the other categories in this minority grouping. But the older trans people, we talked about this notion of gender expression. And one of the things that we think about, and we talk about, who's the most, the most famous, I guess, person who is transgender. And oftentimes in a group, if I was looking at you all, somebody would raise their hand and say Caitlyn Jenner. And so we talk about this idea of transition and how a person who's transgender expresses their gender identity, which is opposite of the sex they were assigned at birth. And for younger people who are in good health, take somebody like Bruce Jenner, who was an Olympic athlete and had lots of money and fame and all of that kind of stuff. And so Caitlyn Jenner ends up being the recipient of some real privilege as it relates to having been Bruce Jenner. And so Caitlyn Jenner had the opportunity to have, all of the surgical procedures and all of the different therapies and stuff to actually transition biologically from male to female. And the reality is that when we look at the older transgender community, the age of coming out is significantly older than what we're seeing in younger generations. Most people who are between 60 and 110 years old today, if they were transgender, really didn't come out until either the spouse passes away. Many of them would have gotten married in traditional marriages, like most people do, conform to society. And or waited until that job retirement, until there's no longer a fear of reprisal for coming out and changing their gender expression. The other side of it that kind of is a differentiation from our experience of thinking through like the Bruce Jenner to Caitlyn Jenner transition is the health, right? So here's a population of people who come to terms with or come out into their transgender status at a later age, 65 to 70 years old, and oftentimes are in poorer health because, again, some of those similar health disparities. And so, transitioning from a surgical procedure is not only expensive, it's also incredibly invasive. And so a person's health really needs to be at a place where they can withstand those procedures. So for most transgender older adults, that transition is really a transition of gender expression. Right. We had that slide where we talk about gender expression, how we express ourselves on a scale from masculine to feminine and everything in between. So a person who's transgender is oftentimes just based on societal stereotypes, dressing and wearing their hair and makeup or not makeup, jewelry or not jewelry, based on societal stereotypes for the gender that they identify with. Some of those people, some older transgender folks, will also incorporate the use of hormone therapy. And so we don't always think about, but a biological male whose gender identity is female can take female hormones and actually reduce the growth of facial hair, actually can grow some breast tissue, can reduce the Adam's apple and elevate the voice a little bit, so that they get a little bit closer to that feminine expression. And a biological female who is expressing his gender identity of male could take male hormones and again increase the Adam's apple, lower the voice, actually grow some facial hair. If a female has biological female has male pattern baldness in their family, taking male hormones will actually create male pattern baldness for themselves as well. So again, most older transgender folks expressing themselves through gender expression, some use of hormones, and that use of hormones can be just enough to bring that person that much closer. And so when they think about like going to a hospital, going to a nursing home, needing to have care, that fear not only of how will they be treated if their gender identity is known in comparison to the sex they were assigned at birth, or the sex that most of them still have under their expression, but also that fear that maybe there's somebody in the healthcare system that can deny them the use of hormones. And I actually had an older trans person tell me that if the doctor came to her and said, you have stage 4 prostate cancer, right? And this person is living the gender identity of female, but has biological male or sex assigned at birth of male, obviously still has a prostate. And so the doctor says to this person, this is her kind of making this up, but if the doctor came to her and said you have stage 4 prostate cancer and there's a pill that the FDA is just in the process of approving that will cure it, but you'd have to stop taking the hormones that you're taking because there's a conflict between the hormone therapy and this pill to cure your prostate cancer. And her perspective was she would forego the prostate cancer pill because after living 67 years in her maleness through her career and all of that stuff, and finally transitioning to her gender identity of female, that she would rather live whatever life was left in her female gender identity and gender expression than giving up those hormones. So that's how important that little bit more that the hormones can really help that person. So so that's kind of that whole notion of what the older transgender community, in terms of those fears in a very real way, that fear of admissions and who is going to be my roommate and how are they going to make that decision? Is it going to be in light of my gender expression or in light of my biological sex? So when we look at the research as it relates to the things that this community reports in terms of their beliefs, some pretty scary statistics, and I think that this is from 2005, Beliefs in Long-Term Care, and we probably have made some progress in this arena, but at the time, 89% of older LGBT and or T folks predict that staff would discriminate against them if their sexual orientation or their gender identity were known. 81% predict peers would discriminate. So we have this whole issue of the assumption of kind of peer bullying, senior bullying, that there would be significant isolation and discrimination of other residents or other seniors if their sexual orientation or the gender identity were known. And probably the most startling one is that 53% number, right? So 53% of people really believe that staff would abuse them, either physically or emotionally, if their sexual orientation or their gender identity were known. Now, what we know is, even anecdotally, that these numbers are not real numbers in terms of what's actually happening in long-term care or in senior care settings. But in so many ways, right, the reality of it doesn't matter. What people believe is what matters. And so that's really, what caused us to launch this effort of trying to train as many senior service providers as we could on sexual orientation, gender identity, some of the terminology and the unique needs and experience, and some ways that we can create more welcoming environments so that we can help this community feel more at ease coming to us for services. So just a quick slide, because this is, and we actually just recently moved the training to serve curriculum over to a nonprofit called Justice Health, which used to be the Minnesota AIDS Project, and they've gone through a transformation. But because this whole notion of aging goes beyond the fears, the unique needs and barriers, but also we know that 26% of people who are living with HIV are over the age of 55 today. And so there's a lot of things that we really need to consider in that. And you think about now we've got a population of people living with HIV who have been on these really intense cocktails of drugs to reduce their viral load down to a place where it's non-detectable and non-transferable or non-transmittable. But what's the long-term impact of those treatments? And we actually are seeing, I just was chatting with a 62-year-old gentleman the other day who has been living with HIV, I think he said 27 years. And he would tell you that he feels like his body physically is more like that of a 72-year-old, and that he feels like he's having kind of an exacerbation of his aging process. And so there's not a great deal of scientific research yet around that, but we'll see more of that coming out. And then we think about the idea of the aging process and all of those comorbidities, right? So we don't just, we're not just 67, 72 years old and have HIV and been treated for many years. We have glaucoma, we have diabetes, we have high blood pressure, we have, all kinds of Parkinson's, we have Alzheimer's, dementias, a variety of different things. So think about all of the comorbidities that come along with all of that. So you'll see a lot more research coming forward about this whole notion of HIV, AIDS, and the aging process. So we talk about things like what can we do, right? And there's a lot of things that organizations can do, and a lot of things that we as individual practitioners can do. Most of us have more control, of course, of ourselves than we do of our organizations. And so one of the notions, and again, regardless of spirituality, morality, perspectives about sexual orientation, gender identity, is the notion of validation, right? That notion that we can create a welcoming community by doing certain things. We can be mindful of people's history. We can be mindful of the words that we use and the terminology that we use, and we can validate emotions and life experiences regardless of any kind of spiritual notion or moral notion around sexual orientation and gender identity. So this graphic is one of my favorites because it's that constantly interchanging circle that leads from one circle to the other. So thinking through what are the things that we can do to be a welcoming environment. So we do a lot of encouragement around the use of the rainbow flag. And I've literally trained thousands and thousands of people, and actually in the last 3 months have trained almost 500 staff of a local organization, one of the larger senior housing and services organization, Ecumen. And we do a lot of talk about the use of that rainbow symbol and the recognition that the rainbow is a really significant symbol within the LGBT community. But in the broader heterosexual cisgender community, generally the rainbow is viewed as pretty. It's a diverse array of colors, and so what we do is we encourage people to use like a small strip of the rainbow on their name tags. We encourage people to use the rainbow sticker or a Human Rights Campaign sticker, something that would also be easily identified by somebody who was part of the LGBT community, on maybe a tablet that you use for intake or something that you carry around with you a lot. that somebody who identifies as LGBT and or T would see those symbols and would automatically know that even if you are or are not part of the LGBT community, you're at the very least an ally or you're supportive. There are a variety of ways that we can incorporate images of same-sex couples into marketing materials that, again, the average heterosexual or cisgender person would see a picture of two women or two older women or two older men and think, oh, they're just buddies, they're just friends. Oh, look, that facility has happy hour because they've got a glass of wine in their hand. But an older gay or lesbian person would see a picture of same-sex people in your marketing materials as welcoming. They would see it as though your marketing people have thought about them, even though the average heterosexual or cisgender person is not going to identify that as a gay couple. So some things that we can do symbolically, right? And then we think about like the language we use and how we talk and the questions that we ask when we're trying to get to know people. And I think that, again, this is an attempt at covering an awful lot of content in a very brief time. But think about open-ended questions. I think about the forms that we have to fill out. And sometimes our forms will give us the answers that we're looking for, right? Married, single, divorced, widowed. I never ask those questions in that way. So if I ask, were you married? Are you divorced? Are you widowed? What I've done is I've actually identified for that person that my worldview is heterosexist, right? That the only acceptable answers have to do with marriage, divorce, or being widowed. And so what I ask is, in an open-ended way, tell me about the significant relationships in your life, right? So now I've just given the power to that person, and I haven't identified my worldview. Right? I haven't told them that the acceptable answers are A, B, and C. And so I do that as much as possible using open-ended questions in those initial intakes. And I also do that by telling people that I don't make any assumptions about them, right? So the notion that I'm going to ask you some questions maybe that are different than other people have asked you, right? So if I ask the question, how do you identify your gender, right? 99% of the time, the person is going to look at me, as though I've just walked off of the planet Mars. But for 1% of the people who may identify as transgender, right, that's going to be their opening to make a decision about whether they're comfortable sharing that perspective with me or not. And the reality is that that's not the litmus test. Right? It's not success or failure if somebody comes out to us or doesn't come out to us. What success looks like, though, is that we've done as many things as we can do individually or within our organization to express to the members of the LGBT community that they don't need to be as afraid as the research says that they are, and also that we are welcoming, we do understand. And I think the kind of the last thing that I'll mention, then we'll open it up for questions, is, I think that we as a society, and unfortunately I don't think this has gotten any better. I think it's probably gotten worse in recent years. But I think we have this notion that people are closed-minded, people don't get it, and especially older people. We love to place older people in that box, right? That older people don't get it, they don't understand sexual orientation, they're not going to get it, they don't want to get it. And the reality is that my experience has been that older adults, people 60 to 110 years old today, have a lot more capacity than we give them credit for. And an example I'll share is, 18 years ago, my husband and I started this home care endeavor, which has been amazing. But we both quit our jobs, put our life savings on the line, to do this. So it's got to work, right? And so the funny part is I decided that stopping wearing the earring in my left ear was going to be the thing that would keep people from knowing that I was gay, because my fear was that, I would go out to potential clients and they would figure out somewhere along the line that I was gay, and they would decide to use a different home care agency. And the example is very early on, I had a client named Catherine, and she was from New Jersey, and I do a terrible Jersey accent, so I won't do it because if you're from Jersey, you'll be offended. So, but Catherine, what does every 85-year-old widow want to know about the 31-year-old guy that's sitting across the table from them, signing them up for home care services, right? Are you married? Do you have a girlfriend? And so Catherine was just like every other 85-year-old widowed woman, wanted to know if I was married. And of course, my answer was no, because at the time it wasn't legal, so Bob and I weren't married. And do I have a girlfriend? Well, clearly I didn't have a girlfriend, so that was easy. So I wasn't lying, right? But I wasn't, I was not being authentic. But that was my answer at the time. And Catherine persisted, and she would actually periodically pick up the phone and actually call me and ask me if I had a girlfriend yet and whatnot. And it was a lot of energy, right? And one time when I was back at Catherine's to do her annual reassessment, and she launched into it again, and I said, you know what, Catherine, I wish we didn't have to spend all this time and energy talking about my marital status or whether I have a girlfriend, because you know what, I'm never going to get married. And Catherine looked at me, and she kind of cocked her head, and she said, you better be careful who you say that to, because they might think you're, are you? And I said, yes, Catherine, I'm gay. And you know what? She was hurt. She was legitimately hurt that I didn't trust her with that information, that we had this relationship where I was providing caregivers and I was providing her other resources, and that I didn't trust her with that. And so I changed my answer at that moment. I said, you know what? I'm not doing this anymore. So from that point on, and this is like 17 years and counting, well, it's different now because I am married, but for many years, my answer when the 85-year-old widowed woman asks me about marriage, and they ask every time, I would say, if it were legal, I would be. And almost universally, the response was, what? Oh, what's his name? And I can honestly tell you that I don't think I've ever lost a client because of my sexual orientation. And of course, today, with being married, I refer to my husband, pretty regularly. So I just think we really, and specifically, we don't give seniors credit for being able to understand constructs. And so when we ask that question about gender identity, the notion that they can't possibly fathom, because they grew up hearing about hermaphrodites, children that were born with confusing or both genitalia. So it ends up being a quick little educational conversation, and then we move on. So anyway, if you don't remember anything else, you'll remember that sexual orientation and gender identity are completely different things. They have nothing to do with each other. LGB is about sexual orientation. T is about gender identity. And I guess at this point, I'll open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. Great presentation.
Thanks.
Yes, everyone, it is time for Q&A, so please send in your questions, and we will get to them right here, post-haste. First question for you here, Paul. What are your thoughts about implementing LGBT education in long-term care communities?
I think it's critical, and that's what I do. I mean, we've literally trained 13,000 senior service providers, and by that I mean staff in long-term care communities, assisted living communities, elder law attorneys, home care agencies, hospice agencies. I think it's really, really critical. And interesting, one of the things that I'm also doing, I actually just created. I've done this a couple of times, and I just created a flyer for one that I'm doing in one of our suburban senior communities, is a program for residents to talk about gender identity and sexual orientation. Because one of the things that I've realized over the years of doing this, and I usually just kind of launch the session with this as part of the explanation going into it, this doesn't just have to do with the older LGBT population, right? Because the reality is that projecting a welcoming community for them is really important. But we have clients and residents who are heterosexual and cisgender who may have children, right, or adult family members who are helping coordinate their care who identify as LGBTQ. And we also have coworkers, right? And that's really important, that organizations need to recognize that we have employees who identify as LGBTQ. And we think about this notion of doing an educational session for the residents of a community to combat that bullying, right? You can't sit at my table because you're a lesbian. And also for our staff. We have, in this particular community that I'm going to in a few weeks, right, they have dietary staff, a couple of them who are transitioning from either female to male or male to female and are in the midst of that, and a couple that are gender queer or gender neutral who don't subscribe strongly masculine or feminine. And the seniors, the residents will ask them, so are you a boy or a girl? Right? And so helping the residents understand gender identity in a very real way will help the employment experience as well.
Okay, great. Paul, you were talking a little bit earlier about the 4-hour training opportunity. Can you give folks a little bit more information about that? I've got a couple questions I'm going to kind of dovetail together with that. Where can people find out some more information?
Sure. You can certainly contact me directly. The 4-hour training is so much better than the 1-hour training, right? I mean, so the 4-hour training, we spend a significant amount of time looking at the history and the timeline of things that happen in our country over the last 100 years that really impact the coping skills and stuff for this population and creates that unique set of needs. And I mean, when you think about like the greatest generation in the first place, right? I think about my grandmother, and this is a small example, but you know, my grandmother, if you sent in a home health aide into my grandmother's house, if she were still alive, she'd be 104. But if they opened up that drawer in the kitchen and they found 3,000 plastic bread bags in that drawer, and as a millennial or Generation X caregiver thought, well, this is really crazy. Why do you have all these bread bags? I'm going to put these in recycling, right? My grandmother would be deeply offended and probably would ask for that person not to come back, because the saving of bread bags and the reusing of things like bread bags, right? You can put a plastic bread bag over your sock and then put your foot in your snow boot and go out and play in the snow and your sock doesn't get wet, right? So the notion of the value of things that my grandmother established because she lived through the Depression, right? Because of the near loss of the farm, that timeline. So we do this extensive exercise around the timeline. We do we do a video case study that shows a lesbian couple that actually did kind of come out and actually never, didn't follow the path that society said, but some real prices to pay for people who tried to live that authentic life as well. We do some scenarios. We've got a couple of different sets of types of scenarios for social workers. We'll a lot of times do a set of ethical scenarios that meet that ethical CEU criteria. And have an opportunity to really go through an environmental sensitivity assessment. And so the last step that we do in the 4-hour training is this environmental sensitivity assessment to talk about policies and procedures and what are the things that organizationally we need to look at to make ourselves more welcoming and to really reinforce those things. So it doesn't feel nearly as frenetic as I probably sound trying to cram a bunch of stuff into a 45-minute presentation. It's much more relaxed and much more thorough. Oftentimes, what we do when, like with Ecumen, with Volunteers of America, with some of the organizations where we've done mass training of everyone, is we will do 4-hour training sessions for kind of the senior leadership team. So kind of the people who really need to buy into this and kind of institute organizationally across the board this culture that says we welcome everyone. And then we do 2-hour sessions for kind of supervisory staff, so anybody that has somebody that reports to them. And then we'll generally do either 1 hour in person or create a 1-hour online training experience for direct care staff and for staff turnover.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Paul. What are some of the key points to discuss with in-home agency caregivers about working with an LGBT client?
I think that the biggest thing, and we train our staff in person, and the biggest thing really is that understanding of the difference between sexual orientation, gender identity, so kind of culling that out, helping them have a really good understanding of that. And that notion of open-ended questions, the notion of being comfortable with terminology, being comfortable with the idea of especially gender identity and that expression of that is really important. And I think probably the concept of the validation, right? That regardless of what it says, like our mission is to improve the quality of life for those we serve, right? Not for some of those we serve, not for most of those that we serve, but it's to improve the quality of life for everyone we serve. And then reminding each other that, like I mentioned earlier, it's not just the older senior that we're helping out in their home, it's also their family members for whom we're providing a great deal of peace of mind and an extra set of eyes and ears with their older adult family member, and then also our coworkers, right? And so understanding terminology, understanding that the older generation does have a unique set of needs and barriers, and it informs how they interact with you, how they perceive that you perceive them, and those are really the kind of the critical core.
Okay. Paul, would you be so kind as to provide us with your email so that people can get in touch with you about that training? Oh,
sure. My email, unfortunately, it seemed like a good extension at the time, but it's PBLOM at RAH-T as in Tom, C as in cat, .net. So it's PBLOM at RAH-TC.net.
Okay. And I just posted that email up there for you, everyone, if you want to get in touch with Paul about the training there. Okay, let's get back to the questions here, Paul. During my home visits, I'm required to ask, what is your sex at birth? With what sex do you identify? What is your sexual orientation? Our in-home assessment questions are regulated by the state, so I have to ask. I think it's important to ask these questions so that those who feel unrecognized have an opportunity to disclose their identity. However, some clients and or family get frustrated with me for asking. Do you have any suggestions on how to help them understand why I am asking these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So really the first part of it is how you start the assessment. And that is really identifying very clearly at the beginning that I'm not going to make any assumptions about you, right? So I'm not going to assume that just because you have white or gray hair that you need me to talk really loud, right? I'm going to let you tell me if I need to speak louder because you have hearing deficiency. I'm not going to assume that because you come from, German ancestry that you want, German sausage and sauerkraut for dinner every night, right? I'm not going to assume anything about you. And by not assuming, that means that there are questions I might ask that you've not been asked before, because a lot of people make assumptions. And then really just saying, so in that vein, here is that question, what was your sex at birth? And really, again, going back to, it gives you the opportunity to kind of have a little educational moment, where you just say, this is, and obviously you have a state law that you can use as backup, but I think also it's just a good practice to say, what, there is, a little bit less than 1% of the time where people are born and the sex that they have confusing or both genitalia, and a lot of times the sex or the gender is chosen by the family and the doctor in the moment before the child is sent home. And oftentimes that, and here's the real brutal honesty of it is, right? It's easier to turn what would be a partial penis into a vagina than it is to create a penis. And so oftentimes the path of least resistance was to create female genitalia. And suddenly at 18 years old or 16 years old or whatever age, the person goes, wait a minute, I don't feel like Danielle. Everything inside of my head says I'm Daniel. And so having that conversation is to say, and a lot of times that person who then doesn't agree with the sex they were assigned at birth lives their life expressing the gender identity and in using hormones. You'd be surprised. I have a trans male client that in particular, there's no way if the question wasn't asked that you would know that this gentleman underneath his gender expression is biologically 100% female. because the use of hormones and how we dress and all of that kind of stuff can really be convincing. And so I hope that helps.
Great. Okay, well, Paul, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our hour here, and it's time for us to wrap up. But I want to thank you for joining us for a great presentation, very important information. Thank you so much today.
Thank you.